Chapter 542. In the end, Gong Sun Chi broke the silence. I have communicated with Minister Dongqing. In principle, he agrees that Black Tortoise will lead a group of Terracotta Army to be temporarily stationed in Reki City and return to Zhongzhou State after the situation is completely stabilized. Li Wangxing, the Black Tortoise of Zhongzhou State, could also be said to be a direct force of Li Tianlan. The achievements of the Snowdance Corps came first, and Dongqing Wudi's full support followed. Coupled with the inclination of the four spirits, the general trend had completely guaranteed Li Tianlan's foundation in Eastern Europe. As long as Tribulation was willing to stay, with his status and strength as the #1 assassin in the Dark World, even if Li Tianlan left Eastern Europe, the Li family would still have absolute influence on Eastern Europe in the future. Li Tianlan looked up at Tribulation. Since Tribulation broke through in East Island more than 3 years ago, his position had become a little awkward. Today, Tribulation was the minister of the Northeast Special Warfare Department of Zhongzhou State and also the director of the Supervisory Council, which was equivalent to a member of parliament. He was transferred from the Northeast Special Warfare Department to the commander of the Snowdance Corps. As long as he was given the title of marshal, his position was also equivalent to that of a member of parliament of Zhongzhou State. It seemed to be the same, but in reality, the difference was huge. After all, Sai City had been entrenched in the northeast for many years, and its influence had long been deep-rooted. Tribulation's role in the Special Warfare Department was nothing more than icing on the cake. But once he left the northeast, he controlled the strongest Special Warfare Battalion in Zhongzhou State. In addition, he was far away in Eastern Europe, so his real power could be said to be doubled. Li Tianlan was now the young governor of Sai City, which naturally belonged to the Li family. Once Tribulation stayed, it meant that Sai City had taken a crucial step in the battle with Kunlun City. 3 years ago, Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud, known as the twin pillars of Sai City, entered the Sky Academy and the Special Operations Bureau of Yuzhou respectively. Now, with the addition of Tribulation, the power of Sai City was gradually spreading beyond the northeast with the addition of Li Tianlan. Such a move was slow, but it was so powerful that no one could refuse it. I can stay. Li Tianlan and Gong Sun Chi could put this matter in front of him, which was enough to show that Dongqing Wudi in the rear had gotten through all the joints and was only waiting for him to nod. Thank you, Marshal Uncle, Li Tianlan said softly. Tribulation shook his head and suddenly seemed to think of something. He said, So, what about Jiang Shangyu? Li Tianlan and Gong Sun Chi looked at each other and said nothing. Jiang Shangyu's transfer was the most wrong thing this time. As the newly appointed vice marshal of the Snowdance Corps, his position could not be changed in the near future, which meant that he would be in Eastern Europe in the near future. But the matter in Eastern Europe was over. Why did Zhongzhou State transfer him from Eastern Europe? At this time, Kunlun City had completely fallen out with Jiang Shangyu. Kunlun City did not have the power to deal with Jiang Shangyu now. Even if it did, Jiang Shangyu was in Eastern Europe. However, Kunlun City was also out of their reach. As for targeting Jiang Shan, what a joke! The title of Jiang Shan Senior Counselor was not just for show. This matter is a little interesting. Tribulation said. Yes, from the moment Chen Qinghuan died in Eastern Europe, all the timing seemed to be just right. The Southeast Group and the Special Warfare Group pushed Jiang Shangyu, and Jiang Shangyu took advantage of the situation to make a breakthrough. He would stay away from Eastern Europe for the time being, so he fell out with Kunlun City. All this was too coincidental. Although there was no deliberate sign, all this seemed very strange. Li Tianlan said slowly, If I'm not mistaken, the Jiang family should have turned to the Southeast Group, or at least to Wang Qinglei. Tribulation turned his head and glanced at Qin Shilai, who had been silent. Qin Shilai shrugged slightly and pointed up. Above the Qin clan was naturally the Lin clan. Tribulation smiled, turned to look at Li Tianlan, and said, It's okay. Even if Li Tianlan left Eastern Europe, the Snowdance Corps would not move in a short time. Tribulation held the military power, had the strong support of the Qin clan, and was in the invincible realm. It was not difficult for him to suppress Jiang Shangyu. Li Tianlan was relieved and said slowly, In that case, we will release the news that the president will arrive in Reki City in a few days. Li Huaqing's visit to Eastern Europe had been discussed after the date of death, but the diplomatic department of Zhongzhou state had never officially issued a document. The reason was naturally very simple. After the date of death, the Snowdance Corps had a great advantage in Reki City, but the advantage was not a victory. Li Huaqing naturally wanted to make the situation more stable. After the trial day, although everything could not be said to be without suspense, there would basically not be too many problems. At this time, the Snowdance Corps naturally had to cooperate with the Ministry of Foreign Affairs to make Li Huaqing's visit more grand. Moreover, after the trial day, almost all the major forces were in a state of no leader. The Shadow Throne was disbanded, and King Tong was disabled. The president of the Heroes Club died in battle, and the murderous weapon was lost. Jiang Qiansong was expelled from the Jiang family of South America. Huan Kong, the lord of the fantasy world, died. Cass Rotter, the leader of the Men in Black, died. The entire Dark World was facing an unprecedented reshuffle. Now, only the Purgatory of Heaven Capital and the Vatican were left in Reki City. These two forces seemed to be looking for opportunities covetously. But as long as Li Huaqing came to Eastern Europe and signed an agreement with Wulan State, presumably these two forces would also feel that the general trend was over. No matter how unwilling they were, they could only withdraw from Eastern Europe. Otherwise, what awaited them was war. Li Tianlan was silent, thinking about the gains and losses after the battle. It was not easy to win this battle. The only thing Li Tianlan could be glad about was that none of the Invincible Realm experts standing beside him had died, but that was all. There were 4 Invincible Realm experts standing beside him: Qin Shilai, Raphael, Tribulation, and Situ Cangyue. Now, all 4 of the Invincible Realm experts were seriously injured. Tribulation was the one with the lightest injury. When he pestered Paul, it could be said that he had broken out his limit. So far, he was still in a state of extreme exhaustion. As for those injuries, he could barely suppress them and slowly recover. Tribulation was also the only one who could recover his combat capability in a short time. Qin Shilai's situation was a little worse than Tribulation's. He could not fight for a year and a half. Sidu Cangyue's situation was a little worse than Qin Shilai's. He and Raphael were in the center of the self-explosion of the Devil Troop. The explosion of the Devil Troop was not only a devil's eye, but also the holy punishment of void absorbed by the devil eye. Such an explosion was equivalent to a head-on attack from a murderous weapon. Situ Cangyue's injury was destined to take a long time to recover. As for Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights, Li Tianlan's expression was a little complicated. The brother-in-law who threw the Dark Saint spear to him at the most critical moment of the battle and finally protected him was still in a coma. He was the strongest among them, but he was also the most seriously injured. When he woke up, not only would he need a long time to recuperate, but it would also depend on his luck whether he could recover his strength. If he was unlucky, even if Raphael was alive, without the combat capability of the Invincible Realm, it would be an extremely heavy loss for the Dark Knights. Li Tianlan shook his head, suddenly stood up and said, "I'm going out for a walk." He got up and left the room. Opposite the robbery ward was a temporarily modified intensive care unit. At this moment, Raphael was lying inside, motionless. Li Tianlan stood by the window of the ward and looked at the motionless figure. After a long silence, he turned around and walked into another ward. "When I was a child. I don't remember." Dongcheng Rushi's clear and melodious voice rang out in the ward. Li Tianlan walked in and looked at Situ Cangyue sitting on the bed. He nodded and said, "Andy." The complexity in Situ Cangyue's eyes flashed away. Then she nodded and said with a smile, "How's the situation outside?" "It's fine." Li Tianlan was silent for a while. He subconsciously avoided Situ Cangyue's gaze and whispered, "We won." "Yes, we won." Situ Cangyue muttered to herself and said softly, "It's good that we won." Dongcheng Rushi stood up happily and pulled Li Tianlan to sit down beside her. The charm in her eyes and eyebrows was natural. Li Tianlan smiled and touched her hair. Dongcheng Rushi relaxed, and her eyes became clearer and brighter. Xianxia also fell silent. No one knew whether it was intentional or not. Whether it was tribulation, Xianxia, Li Tianlan, or even the entire Zhongzhou state, they all avoided a question. Zhongzhou state won the battle on trial day. Because of Li Tianlan's desperate comeback? Because Li Tianlan had the sword energy of the peak of the invincible realm at that moment. But from beginning to end, no one asked Li Tianlan where the sword energy came from. Li Tianlan didn't say it either. He gently stroked Dongqing Rushi's hair and looked at her face with complicated eyes. Xianxia was also looking at Li Tianlan, and her eyes were equally complicated. At the same time, at International Airport, a special plane from Zhongzhou State landed slowly. Reki City had been in constant turmoil in recent days. After trial day, major airlines finally made up their minds and temporarily suspended flights to Now the route situation was chaotic. To be on the safe side, the special plane of Jiang Shangyu, the new vice marshal of the Snowdance Corps of Zhongzhou State, would land at International Airport, and he would be accompanied to Reki City by Cheng Huaining, the commander of the Arctic Ocean Command. People came and went at Airport. Cheng Huaining, with a few guards, stood in the crowd in casual clothes, and his smile looked a little fake. Obviously, he did not welcome Jiang Shangyu to Eastern Europe. The entire Snowdance Corps would not welcome him either. But this was the decision of Zhongzhou State. Even if he was reluctant, Cheng Huaining still had to go through the necessary procedures. The cabin door opened. Jiang Shangyu, who was also in casual clothes and carrying a backpack, appeared in front of the cabin door. His smile was gentle and calm, and his entire body did not have the slightest bit of aura. Coupled with his attire and extremely young face, he looked like a traveler from afar, not a soldier. Cheng Huaining was stunned for a moment, and then he waved his hand. When Jiang Shangyu saw Cheng Huaining, he was stunned. It seemed that he did not expect that Cheng Huaining would come to greet him in person. Then he quickened his pace and walked down the gangway. As soon as his feet landed, he was at least 10 meters away from Cheng Huaining. He had already reached out his hand with a smile on his face. Cheng Huaining moved forward a little. Without the slightest sign, a great force came directly from behind. The great force instantly pressed Cheng Huaining to the ground. However, the hurried roar in his ears sounded at this time. "General, be careful." A sharp sword light almost flew over Cheng Huaining's head and pierced Jiang Shangyu. The extremely condensed sword intent suddenly broke out in front of Jiang Shangyu. The space was completely shattered by this sword, and it was blurry. Jiang Shangyu's smile was a little stiff. Boom! In an instant, the completely broken sword intent completely enveloped Jiang Shangyu. Countless sword energy flew wildly in the airport and destroyed the fighter plane in an instant. Cheng Huaining and several guards were instantly seriously injured. Cheng Huaining's mind was blank. This sudden sword was completely aimed at Jiang Shangyu. The most important thing was that this sword was the real invincible strike. The sword light broke out for a moment. Blood splattered and then dissipated. The airport was in chaos. Cheng Huaining, whose face was livid, stood up and looked in the direction of Jiang Shangyu. Only a backpack was still there, and Jiang Shangyu, whom he was going to greet, had disappeared. Puff! A mouthful of blood sprayed directly from Cheng Huaining's mouth. It was 2 o'clock in the afternoon on August 20th in Eastern Europe. Before it was dark, 2 pieces of news swept through the entire dark world like a hurricane. Withdraw. Before the president of Zhongzhou State visited Reki City. The Purgatory of Heaven capital was the first to announce its withdrawal from Reki City. In less than 5 minutes, the Vatican also announced the withdrawal of all forces in Reki City. Along with this news, Jiang Shangyu, the vice marshal of the Snowdance Corps of Zhongzhou State, was attacked by an invincible realm expert as soon as he arrived in and was now missing. Chapter 543. The retreat of the Purgatory of Heaven capital was not mighty. As a new superpower in the Dark World, with most of the dominators of other forces dead or seriously injured, the Purgatory of Heaven capital could be regarded as the real best in the entire Dark World because of the existence of God. No one would have thought that when all the major forces had invested heavily in Reki City, The first breakthrough in the chaos in Eastern Europe, only 3 people from the purgatory of heaven capital had come. 3 people came. Naturally, there were 3 of them when they left. God, Daybreak, Dawn. 1 was at the peak of the invincible realm, 1 was at the invincible realm, and 1 was at the half-step invincible realm. Although the number of people was small, the lineup could be said to be extremely luxurious. The biggest advantage of having a small number of people was that it was convenient for them to retreat and move covertly. So many major events had happened in Reki City, but except for the night of the trial day, no one could detect the existence of the purgatory of heaven capital. The biggest disadvantage of a small number of people was that without enough support, it was difficult for the purgatory of heaven capital to make any big moves in Reki City. So the purgatory of heaven capital came. So the purgatory of heaven capital left. He came and went in a hurry, like a passerby. The small private plane gradually took off, and Reki City in his sight was gradually becoming smaller. Looking down from top to bottom, this capital of Wulan state used to be extremely prosperous and lively. Perhaps because of the constant storms in recent days, all the streets had become extremely cold. According to official statistics, after the date of death, at least 1/3 of the shopping malls in Reki City were closed, and the number of people in Reki City was reduced by nearly 3/5 in one day. Not everyone had the courage to leave this land permanently, but there were many people who chose to leave temporarily. After the trial day, more people left and more shops closed. The streets and alleys were desolate. Occasionally, some people passed by, but they were all in a hurry. Although the Dark World could be sure that there would be no war in Reki City, the dark clouds of war still did not dissipate. Therefore, the tall buildings were still tall buildings, but at this moment, they looked extremely desolate. Daybreak sat by the window and looked at Reki City, which was getting smaller and smaller, in silence. His handsome face, which could be described as beautiful or devilish, did not have any extra expression, but his eyes were incomparably deep. Such a Reki City reminded him of Yuzhou City during the Spring Festival in Zhongzhou State. It was just as prosperous. It was the same cold silence. Cold, vast, desolate, but incomparably beautiful. Reki City was really beautiful. In the eyes of every big shot in the Dark World, Reki City could be regarded as a peerless beauty that could drive people crazy. Daybreak watched quietly. The plane was rising. Clouds appeared in front of him, clear and faint, misty and indistinct. He subconsciously shook his head, and for the first time, his eyes showed a little regret. What? Deity sat next to Daybreak and closed his eyes to rest. He seemed to feel the change in his mood and asked aloud. It's nothing. Daybreak shook his head, hesitated, and couldn't help but ask, Your Highness, are we really going to give up Reki City? The geographical location of Wulan State was too important. If this country could fall into the hands of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, the future of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, which occupied East Island and Wulan State, was almost unimaginable. Maybe in 10 or 20 years, it could completely recover its vitality and be on par with the Wang family of Beihai. Now it was so easy to let it go? How could he be willing? If you haven't fought for it, how is that considered giving up? Deity said calmly. Daybreak's expression became serious. Why don't we compete? Because it's not time yet. Deity said slowly. Daybreak raised his eyebrows and subconsciously rubbed a dark ring in his hand, as if he was thinking about something. The ring spun tightly against his finger, like a small shadow. There seemed to be countless tiny runes flashing in the shadow, which looked delicate and strange. Are you waiting for this? Daybreak raised the ring on his hand. Deity opened his eyes and glanced at it. There was some regret in his eyes. I can't wait. This dark ring was the murderous weapon Shadow the Ripper, which belonged to the Purgatory of Heaven Capital. Shadow the Ripper was not in the hands of Deity, but had always been in the hands of Daybreak. This alone showed how stable his position in the Purgatory of Heaven Capital was. It had been nearly 4 years since the final battle of Heaven Capital. Shadow the Ripper had also recovered some firepower, but it would take at least a year to reach the state of fire. The chaos in Eastern Europe could not be delayed until then. But it doesn't matter much if there is one less murderous weapon. To put it bluntly, Reki City is just a breakthrough in the chaos. Li Tianlan took down Wulan State, and his credit is naturally greater than the sky. Now it seems that he has defended it. But the trial day just eliminates some forces that can't go to the end. The situation in the whole of Eastern Europe now seems clear. Who can say what the situation will be in the end? Deity said calmly, let me give you an example. For example, if Li Tianlan dies today, who will Reki City belong to now? How is this possible? Daybreak shook his head subconsciously. I heard that President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State will visit Wulan State in the near future. If everything is settled, Li Tianlan should return to Zhongzhou State with President Li Huaqing. Then, there is no next. Deity said meaningfully, it's certain that Li Tianlan wants to go back, but do you really think he can leave? Daybreak's eyes narrowed. Deity turned to look out of the window and whispered, the final battle hasn't begun yet. Who can leave unscathed until the end? The sound of light footsteps rang out. Dawn, who looked 70% to 80% similar to Daybreak, walked over quickly and said in a deep voice, Your Highness, I just received news that Jiang Shangyu, Vice Marshal of the Snowdance Corps, was attacked as soon as he entered IM and is now missing. He handed over the handheld computer in his hand, which was playing the news of IM International Airport. Deity laughed. He glanced at Daybreak and said blandly, Look, I told you that he can't leave now. He looked down at the handheld computer quietly. On the computer screen, the picture of IM International Airport was playing. Deity watched it twice from beginning to end, then shook his head with a chuckle. He's a smart man. From now on, I'm afraid that he will really open up the sky. You mean Jiang Shangyu? Daybreak asked. Deity nodded and said in a calm and affirmative tone, This man is extraordinary. Daybreak looked at the picture seriously. After a long time, he said slowly, self-directed and self-acted? Who knows? Deity shook his head. This is not the problem we should care about now. It's the Snowdance Corps that should have a headache. Daybreak took the handheld computer and looked at it again. He asked casually, Where are we going now? Now, Deity narrowed his eyes. At this moment, he thought of a lot of things. The Purgatory of Heaven capital was a superpower that had early warning of the chaos in Eastern Europe. As early as more than 3 years ago, before the final battle of East Island began, he had been prepared for today's situation. The Samsara Palace did not let him down and developed the situation to the present point. Now the Purgatory of Heaven capital and the Samsara Palace still had cooperation. And he also had cooperation with the mysterious His Majesty. Who did the Samsara Palace and the mysterious His Majesty cooperate with? What about the Wang family of Beihai? With the withdrawal of the superpowers, the general trend of the entire dark world had now completely gathered on these few superpowers. Everything was coming to an end. A video communication flashed on the screen of the handheld computer. Daybreak returned the computer to Deity, coughed dryly, and said with a smile, It's Phoenix. Deity shook his head and did not take it. Your Highness, where are we going? Dawn asked the same question as Daybreak. Deity was silent. After a long time, he slowly said, Go to Mormons. Everything would erupt in the northernmost city of the Snow Empire that was enveloped by the polar night. It was nearing the end, and there had to be an end. Chapter 544. Li Tianlan received 2 pieces of news in the car on his way back. When the phone rang, Li Tianlan was sitting in the car with Dongqing Rushi in his arms, looking out of the window. It was windy and rainy in Reki City. But perhaps because he was about to leave, the wind and rain in the empty city made Li Tianlan feel exquisite and good. Then 2 pieces of news came one after another. The Purgatory of Heaven capital and the Vatican officially withdrew from Reki City. Before he could feel the surprise, the news that Jiang Shangyu had been attacked and disappeared in Im reached his ears. The 2 pieces of news arrived almost at the same time. It was not a great sorrow or joy, but the difference in mood was still very clear. Even Li Tianlan was stunned for a while with the phone in his hand. What's wrong? Dongqing Rushi's voice was lazy and soft. After the most intimate relationship, she gradually let go of some insignificant reservations. She leaned in Li Tianlan's arms, arched her little head, and looked very happy. The Purgatory of Heaven Capital and the Vatican have withdrawn, Li Tianlan said. He paused and continued, they have withdrawn from Reki City. The intelligence showed that the two forces had indeed left Reki City, but they had not shown any intention of leaving Eastern Europe for the time being. Obviously, even if the two forces gave up Wulan State, they still did not want to give up Eastern Europe. In theory, Eastern Europe was too big for any force to monopolize. Now, there were only a few forces qualified to share the cake in Eastern Europe. Snowdance Corps, the Wang family of Beihai, the Vatican, the Purgatory of Heaven Capital. Other forces had been eliminated, and only 4 forces were left to divide up Eastern Europe. As long as they operated patiently, there would be gains. At this time, they suddenly gave up Wulan State, which had already been settled. There was no doubt that they wanted to find a new breakthrough. The 5 Eastern European countries centered on Wulan State could be said to represent 1/3 of the interests of Eastern Europe. Wang Tianzong said that he wanted to take down all of Eastern Europe. At present, the possibility was very small. But if he broke through, it would not be a big problem to take down Snow Country, which was also 1/3 of the interests. For the remaining 1/3, would the Purgatory of Heaven Capital and the Vatican fight or make peace? Or would they play a game for Xianxia State before fighting for the 1/3? Li Tianlan rubbed his forehead and suddenly felt that the whole thing had become complicated again. This is a good thing. Dongqing Rushi thought for a while and said seriously, for now, it doesn't look too bad. Li Tianlan shook his head. But when the Purgatory of Heaven Capital and the Vatican withdrew from Eastern Europe, Xianxia, who had just arrived in Im, was attacked and disappeared. This news was extremely sudden to everyone. Dongqing Rushi was also stunned. Now in the whole Dark World, Jiang Shangyu could be said to be a young expert second only to Li Tianlan, with the combat capability of the Invincible Realm, the new vice marshal of the Snowdance Corps. He had just arrived in Eastern Europe when he suddenly disappeared, missing after being attacked. Was he caught? Or did he escape? Dongqing Rushi frowned and said hesitantly, did the Purgatory of Heaven Capital or the Vatican do it? I won't. Li Tianlan shook his head with certainty. They don't have to do that. Jiang Shangyu alone can't affect the overall situation at present. For Xianxia State, it's a brainless provocation. If they are not satisfied with what Eastern Europe has gained in this chaos, they should target me, not Jiang Shangyu, who has not been in touch with the specific affairs of the Snowdance Corps. But if it wasn't them, who else would do it? Dongqing Rushi murmured to herself in confusion. No, it should be said that if it wasn't them, who else could do it? Li Tianlan said calmly. Dongqing Rushi froze for a moment. The situation in all of Eastern Europe, which was extremely clear but seemed to be shrouded in a layer of gauze, suddenly became clear at this moment with Li Tianlan's words. The chaos in Eastern Europe could be said to be the chaos that the Dark World had not seen in nearly 100 years. After the date of death and the trial day, the divine and holy lists had been fragmented. Li Tianlan and Jiang Shangyu had not yet entered the Invincible Realm. But the problem was that there were not many Invincible Realm experts in the Dark World now. For the current Dark World, Li Tianlan and Jiang Shangyu were the top combat capability. They attacked Jiang Shangyu in an instant and made him disappear. At present, only the Vatican and the Purgatory of Heaven Capital had this kind of strength. If it wasn't them, who else could do it? Li Tianlan twitched the corner of his mouth. His face suddenly became a little ugly. From the looks of it so far, Dongqing Rushi's voice was clear and calm. You are the most suspicious. Li Tianlan obviously thought of this. He smiled bitterly and did not speak. Jiang Shangyu was related to the general trend, but it was not important, at least not now. So the Vatican and the Purgatory of Heaven Capital would not focus on him. And Wang Tianzong was now imprisoned in the ruins of the office of the president, so it was impossible for him to take action. Now in the land of Eastern Europe, only Li Tianlan was the most suspicious person to attack Jiang Shangyu. Jiang Shangyu was not important to the general trend of the Dark World, but for the general trend of Xianxia State and the Snowdance Corps, he was crucial. Li Tianlan had always been strong. He dared to kill Qin Qinghuan in front of Wang Tianzong. Naturally, he dared to attack Xianxia as soon as he arrived in Eastern Europe. This was the most likely speculation. As for whether there were any experts around Li Tianlan who could capture or even kill Jiang Shangyu in an instant, Li Tianlan's heart gradually sank. He knew that there were still such experts, and they would be on his side. The key was that he didn't know how many people in the outside world knew about this. The master of Samsara Palace was still alive. This was not a simple rumor. If the high-level officials of Zhongzhou State knew this news, combined with Jiang Shangyu's disappearance, it was enough to make them think too much. Let's not talk about the master of Samsara Palace. Lin Fengting, the patriarch of the Lin clan, was still free. Li Tianlan didn't care what the outside world thought, but he cared about the attitude of the core of Zhongzhou State. Once they also thought that he had attacked Jiang Shangyu, it was tantamount to violating the rules. To put it bluntly, he had stepped on the line. At such a sensitive moment, stepping on the line naturally had to pay the price. A great price. Li Tianlan silently took out his mobile phone and dialed a number. "Your Highness, this is Riker." The phone was quickly connected, and the voice of Prime Minister Riker of Wulan State sounded. "Have you heard about Vice Marshal Jiang Shangyu?" Li Tianlan asked directly. "I've already got the news." Riker's voice was a little strange, as if he wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Li Tianlan took a deep breath. Even Riker's tone had changed. It could be imagined how strong the outside world's suspicion of him was now. "You contact I'm in the name of Wulan State. In addition, the Arctic Ocean Command will fully cooperate with your actions to find him. In any case, you must find Vice Marshal Jiang in the shortest time." Li Tianlan's tone was calm. "All right, I'll arrange it right away." Seeing that Li Tianlan had no other instructions, Riker hung up the phone. Li Tianlan put down the phone, and his face had completely calmed down. The Snowdance Corps was the biggest winner so far in the chaos in Eastern Europe, but the new vice marshal was attacked and disappeared when he just arrived in Eastern Europe. This was simply a joke, and it would make many people in Zhongzhou State question his ability to control Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan didn't care about these things. But the most important thing was that this was a black pot prepared for him, and he was pinned in Eastern Europe. If Jiang Shangyu did not appear as the commander of the Snowdance Corps, he naturally could not leave Eastern Europe. Chapter 545. The army headquarters building of Zhongzhou State was solemn and majestic, quiet and solemn. There were no so-called flowers and leaves here. The square, the building, and the star flag were almost eternal symbols. At first glance, the entire army headquarters building was clearly visible. It stood in the city of Yuzhou, with an extremely calm and domineering air. Most of the time, the army headquarters building was quiet. In this building, which was filled with the smell of iron and blood, everyone walked in a hurry. No one would make a loud noise. It seemed that everyone was in awe of something from the bottom of their hearts. But at this moment, there was a loud and angry roar in the executive minister's office on the top floor of the army headquarters building. The loud but weak voice came out of the office and spread throughout the entire floor, making the ears of some ordinary secretaries buzz. What does Li Tianlan want to do? Does he take the army headquarters and Kunlun City seriously? Does he take the overall situation seriously? Does he take Zhongzhou State seriously? He is the commander of the Snowdance Corps, but it doesn't mean that the Snowdance Corps is Li Tianlan's independent kingdom. Does he want to have troops in Eastern Europe? He's still too young. In Dongsheng Wudi's office, Gu Xingyun, the state-protecting war god of Zhongzhou State, almost slapped the table to vent his emotions. His eyes were red, and he was in an extremely irritable state, almost crazy. Gu Qianchuan was seriously injured. Gu Xingyun himself was seriously injured. Kunlun City, which had temporarily lost 2 invincible realm experts, was unprecedentedly weak. Although Jiang Shangyu had fallen out with Kunlun City, his position was personally appointed by Kunlun City after all. As a result, as soon as he arrived in Eastern Europe, Jiang Shangyu was attacked. He had been missing for more than 24 hours, and there was still no news. In today's dark world, Li Tianlan was naturally the one who could and was the most suspicious of doing this. As long as something happened to Jiang Shangyu in Eastern Europe, as the commander of the Snowdance Corps, Li Tianlan would be responsible. In Gu Xingyun's view, this was exactly what Li Tianlan wanted. If Jiang Shangyu could not be found, Li Tianlan could naturally stay in Eastern Europe and run Wulan State. It might be a little harsh to say that he had troops for himself, but in Gu Xingyun's eyes, Li Tianlan had completely exposed his ambition to use Eastern Europe and Zhongzhou State to play with Gu Xingyun. Jiang Shangyu's falling out with Kunlun City had already made Gu Xingyun lose face. As a result, as soon as he arrived in Eastern Europe, Li Tianlan took action without any buffer. This was completely equivalent to not taking Kunlun City in his eyes at all. It was even equivalent to a hard kick in Gu Xingyun's face. How could Gu Xingyun endure it? Most importantly, the word missing was enough to stimulate his nerves. 2 days ago, Gu Qianchuan, the first elder of Kunlun City, went to Beijiang to pick up Gu Fenghua. As a result, he was severely injured by Qin Weibai with a mysterious power and fled. Until today, Gu Qianchuan had not come back and there was no news. Not only Jiang Shangyu, but Gu Qianchuan was also missing. What was worse was that Jiang Shan, the counselor of Beijiang province, reported the news to Kunlun City unhurriedly nearly 20 hours after the incident. Jiang family, Li Tianlan, this year's graduate, Qin Weibai. More and more people did not take Kunlun City seriously. After the maneuver of the two academies, Gu Xingyun was surprised to find that the status of Kunlun City had begun to decline at a stunning speed. All the negative emotions in his heart broke out completely after the news of Jiang Shangyu's disappearance came, so that he directly rushed into Dongqing Wudi's office and roared regardless of anything. Gu Xingyun's voice was like thunder. After his hysterical outburst, he put his hands on the table, and his heavy breathing was extremely harsh. When his mood gradually calmed down, Dongqing Wudi smiled and poured a cup of tea for Gu Xingyun. He said calmly, "Your Highness, at present, no one can confirm that the disappearance of Vice Marshal Jiang Shangyu is related to Tianlan. You don't have to be excited. Do you think this matter should be investigated?" Gu Xingyun was stunned. Looking at the smile on Dongqing Wudi's face, he suddenly realized that there was something wrong with his mentality. In his life, he wanted to strengthen Kunlun City and the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State, instead of taking the elite route like the Li family before. He did a good job, but it was obviously impossible to develop a comprehensive system to compete with the army headquarters in just 20 years. Therefore, on many sensitive personnel matters, Kunlun City must reach an agreement with the army headquarters. When the former minister Qi Beizong took office again, Gu Xingyun and Qi Beizong had the same position. They cooperated happily, and the special warfare group also flourished. But now the minister of the army headquarters was Dongqing Wudi. If they wanted to reach an agreement, they needed compromise and balance. Moreover, he knew what would happen if he mentioned Li Tianlan's problem in front of Dongqing Wudi. Gu Xingyun's face was cloudy, and he began to be lost in thought for a while. Recently, he was really physically and mentally exhausted. The great pressure and a series of bad news almost made him lose control of his emotions. Compared with Dongqing Wudi, who was also under the same pressure but still calm, Gu Xingyun finally realized that he was still impetuous. He slowly sat opposite Dongqing Wudi, picked up the teacup, and took a sip without saying a word. Dongqing Wudi looked at Gu Xingyun quietly. Among the top figures with high status and power in Zhongzhou State, he and Gu Xingyun were now the two most dangerous and under the most pressure. Kunlun City now seemed to have no loss of strength, but for the time being it had no peak combat capability, which made it passive everywhere. Once its reputation declined, its actual interests would inevitably shrink. After the end of the maneuver of the two academies, it could be seen from the final choices of those elite students. In this final maneuver of the two academies, Kunlun City lost a considerable part of its future. Dongqing Wudi was also having a hard time now. The trial day broke out in Eastern Europe, and the night in Yuzhou was also turbulent. The influence of the private transfer of troops was breaking out at an appalling speed and getting worse. One of his trusted deputy commanders in the garrison corps had been put in prison. The Air Force headquarters was in turmoil. In the Navy, The resignation of a deputy commander at the level of colonel of the fleet was the fuse. Now the fire was getting bigger and bigger. In various theaters of operations in recent days, several generals had expressed on different occasions that they clearly drew a line with Dongqing Wudi. And these generals used to be considered Dongqing Wudi's direct subordinates. Within the Border Control Corps, the game between Di Jiang and several commanders was also intensifying. Even within the giant group, there were voices against Dongqing Wudi. Compared with Gu Xingyun, who was in decline but still irreplaceable for the time being, how long Dongqing Wudi could hold the position of the standing minister of the army headquarters had become the concern of the whole Zhongzhou state. Dongqing Wudi didn't worry much. Although he was under a lot of pressure, he was much calmer than Gu Xingyun. This time, he knew very well that whether he would fall or not, this was the beginning of the decline of Kunlun city. Because of the rise of Li Tianlun. As for the Dongqing clan and himself, even if he was really forced to resign this time, the future of the Dongqing clan would still be infinitely bright. This was also because of the rise of Li Tianlun. No matter what would happen in the future, he would regard it as the last part of his political career. On this road, Dongqing Wudi relaxed and was fearless of everything. Only this relaxed and presumptuous mentality could make him the real god of massacre of Zhongzhou state. If God stood in his way, he would kill God. If Buddha stood in his way, he would kill Buddha. The delicate silence was finally broken. Gu Xingyun put down the teacup and said in a low voice, "Anyway, Li Tianlan is responsible. Jiang Shangyu just arrived in Eastern Europe, and Li Tianlan didn't play any role. I don't see his responsibility." Dongqing Wudi was still smiling and he said calmly, "I can only see Tianlan's contribution to Zhongzhou state. Your Highness, you know what this means. It's no exaggeration to say that in the whole of Eastern Europe, as long as we take down the 5 countries in Eastern Europe, Zhongzhou state can even give up Snow Country. Although the 5 countries in Eastern Europe are not big, they are important cornerstones for Zhongzhou state to completely establish its position as the world's hegemon. It's no exaggeration to describe Tianlan's contribution. As for Jiang Shangyu, he was attacked in Im, and he didn't even arrive at the station of the Snowdance Corps. In order to protect him, Commander Cheng Huaining of the Arctic Ocean Command was also seriously injured. Without prior preparation, Jiang Shangyu's disappearance was completely an accident. Dongqing Wudi said calmly, "And even if he disappeared inside the Snowdance Corps, what does it mean? Tianlan led the army north to expand the territory on behalf of Zhongzhou state, not to be a nanny. If Jiang Shangyu was really so important, why did he send him to Eastern Europe in the first place?" Gu Xingyun's face changed slightly. This was tantamount to directly transferring the contradiction to Kunlun city. Gu Xingyun avoided Dongqing Wudi's gaze and said, "Minister, do you mean that, as the marshal of the Snowdance Corps, Li Tianlan has no responsibility for Jiang Shangyu's disappearance? He has the credit. Merit is merit and fault is fault. If the two can be confused, then many things will be difficult to deal with. Well, he has the credit. No one denies what he did in Eastern Europe, but Li Tianlan's temper is too strong and overbearing. Even if we don't talk about Jiang Shangyu, it's against the rules for him to kill Qin Qinghuan. Even if Qin Qinghuan violated the military order, it didn't affect the overall situation. Why kill him? If what he did in Eastern Europe is not dealt with, I think many comrades will have something to say." "Yes, he has the credit." Gu Xingyun opened his mouth and looked at Dongqing Wudi. For a moment he didn't know what to say. He didn't care about Jiang Shangyu this time. Since Jiang Shangyu had completely fallen out with him, in his opinion, it was better for him to die. All the venting today was about Jiang Shangyu, but all the targets were Li Tianlan. He thought that Li Tianlan wanted to stay in Eastern Europe to run Wulan state at all costs. Such wild ambition had touched the bottom line of Kunlun city. Gu Xingyun was even a little afraid. He had not recovered from his injury. After a long time, 3 years, 5 years, if Li Tianlan, who developed unscrupulously in Eastern Europe, returned to Zhongzhou state again, who could control him? Gu Xingyun gritted his teeth and suddenly said, "Minister, there are some things that can't be ignored. I still suggest that Li Tianlan be transferred back to Zhongzhou state immediately." It's better to let others deal with the affairs in Eastern Europe. What he said was straightforward and clear. Dongqing Wudi narrowed his eyes and said with the same smile, "What's the reason? Like father, like son. Everyone knows what his father is like. Now Li Tianlan is in charge of a large number of troops. Bullshit." Dongqing Wudi, who had been smiling, suddenly put on a cold face and directly swore. He looked at the stunned Gu Xingyun and said expressionlessly, "Like father, like son? Are you even qualified to comment on his father?" Gu Xingyun was stunned for a moment and suddenly became angry out of shame. "What do you mean? Don't tell me I can't evaluate one. You just can't evaluate it." Dongqing Wudi said with cold eyes, "Like father, like son? Very good. If that's the case, it's best to let Tianlan take charge of the army." Gu Xingyun stood up and pointed at Dongqing Wudi, his fingertips trembling slightly. "You are simply unreasonable." Dongqing Wudi waved his hand and said in a cold voice, "See the guest out." Chapter 546. The midsummer in Mormons was still as cold as winter. It rained in the cold winter. The endless rain seemed to drift from Reki City to the northernmost part of snow country. It was not hurried, but the rain mixed with some broken ice hit people's faces and made them feel painful. Mormons in the Rain was an extremely sharp city. The everlasting night remained unchanged. It rained between heaven and earth, and it was as sharp as a sword. When Deity got off the plane, the night in Mormons was dark and hazy. He looked down at the time on his watch. In a trance, he couldn't tell whether it was day or night. Wisps of white air rose with his breath. At this time, it was the warmest season in Mormons. He reached out his hand and shook it casually. Feeling the cold rain between his fingers, he was silent for a long time. A black off-road vehicle was parked not far in front of the plane. As soon as Deity got off the plane, the door of the off-road vehicle had been opened. A middle-aged man less than 50 years old walked over quickly. The middle-aged man's appearance was not outstanding, but his every move was unusually calm. He was the kind of person who could make people feel at ease at first glance. Deity glanced at him, and his eyes softened quietly. He smiled and waved at him. The middle-aged man paused and glanced at Daybreak. His eyes were a little cold. Then he walked up to Deity and said expressionlessly, "Where are you going, Your Highness?" This attitude was definitely not good. But Deity didn't mind at all. He just smiled kindly and said, "Have you had dinner? Do you want to have a bite nearby?" "No need." The middle-aged man said blandly, "Where are you going?" "Tianyin, watch your attitude." Daybreak finally couldn't bear it anymore. "Don't forget who is standing in front of you." "Attitude?" The middle-aged man's voice was cold. He seemed to be responding to Daybreak, but his eyes were looking straight into Deity's eyes. He was sharp and direct. "What attitude do you want?" Daybreak's eyes darkened, and he was faintly angry. Deity suddenly waved his hand. "Well, we're on the same side. What's the point of quarreling as soon as we meet? I'm not talking to him." Tianyin looked at Deity calmly. "Your Highness, what attitude do you want?" Dawn and Daybreak's faces changed. They looked at Deity and wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. Deity fell silent. The atmosphere in the heavy rain suddenly became a little depressing. "Your Highness, Tianyin isn't." The anger in Daybreak's eyes suddenly subsided, and he pleaded for Tianyin. Deity waved his hand. He looked into Tianyin's eyes and said softly, "What I want is your attitude." "My attitude is very clear." Tianyin's tone was calm. Deity took a deep look at him, walked past him, and got into the off-road vehicle. Tianyin stood there, bathed in the rain, his eyes clear and stubborn. "What are you doing?" Daybreak winked at Dawn, asking him to follow Deity. Then he walked up to Tianyin and questioned him in a low voice. "Purgatory of Heaven Capital." Tianyin. The three masters under the god of the Purgatory of Heaven Capital were Daybreak, Dawn, and Phoenix, who respectively controlled the most elite and terrifying Sunluo, life-prolonging, and Athanasi halls in the Purgatory of Heaven Capital. However, the code name, Tianyin, was not ordinary. In the Purgatory of Heaven Capital, Being able to use the word Tian as a code name had an extraordinary meaning. Tian Yin was the deputy captain of the Athanasia Hall. He was at the peak of the thundershocking realm and was also Phoenix's most important assistant. This position was very high in the purgatory of Heaven Capital, but it was still far from deities. But the problem was that inside the purgatory of Heaven Capital, there were too many stories about their own positions. How could a simple position determine the hierarchy? The relationship between Tian Yin and deity was no less than that between Daybreak and deity. But even so, he still thought that Tian Yin's performance was a bit excessive this time. Secretly competing with His Highness and confronting deity were two completely different concepts. Nothing. Tian Yin said expressionlessly. Nothing. Why are you crazy? Daybreak sneered. Tian Yin looked at the falling rain in the night. After a long time, he said faintly, "The rain is too heavy. I don't like it." He turned around and walked to the off-road vehicle. Daybreak looked at his back quietly. Tian Yin's back was straight, but he felt a trace of loneliness from this straightness. Daybreak was a little annoyed and lost in thought. Loneliness. He had never thought that Tian Yin would feel lonely among them. This was a real brother who had saved him, Daybreak, and even deity. He was also a brother who had been saved by him and deity. On the battlefield, they could trust each other with all their lives. He would be lonely. But Daybreak shook his head hard and walked to the off-road vehicle. The rain in Mormons was too heavy, and the purgatory of Heaven Capital was too big. In the vast purgatory of Heaven Capital, he suddenly wanted to know who else would feel lonely. The off-road vehicle turned around and left in the increasingly messy heavy rain. Tian Yin was silent as he drove. "Did we get anything in Mormons?" Deity broke the silence and suddenly asked. "No." Tian Yin shook his head. He was a little serious, but his tone was still a little bland. "The Samsara Palace left almost no traces here. We have checked in all fields, but there is no trace of the Samsara Palace. After the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, I investigated some members of the Polar Ground Alliance and found a lot of things. There are a total of 22 four-star deacons who may be from the Samsara Palace, but it is only a possibility. According to our analysis, the lowest possibility is less than 5%, and the highest possibility is only 17%. Again, we haven't found any evidence at present." Deity did not speak, but the corners of Daybreak's eyes twitched, and they looked at each other. Before the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance, it was the largest and only superpower in Eastern Europe. In this behemoth spanning many countries in Eastern Europe, deacons were the real main force. The highest level of deacons was 5-star, and above them were the members of the alliance. It was no exaggeration to say that any 4-star deacon was a respected middle-level or high-level figure in the Polar Ground Alliance. How many 4-star deacons were there in the entire Polar Ground Alliance? How many could they put down in Snow Country? If the Samsara Palace really had the ability to control 22 4-star deacons, it meant that they had monopolized nearly 1/5 of the Polar Ground Alliance's right to speak. This was simply a fantasy. They really hit it well. Deity whispered to himself. The purgatory of Heaven Capital had started to make arrangements in Mormons more than 3 years ago. The earliest time was even before the final battle of East Island. At that time, Xianxia state was still plotting against East Island. The master of Samsara Palace had just made an appointment to fight Gu Xingyun, and Daybreak had the first talk with Qin Weibai. In the end, there was the overall situation of the cooperation between the Samsara Palace and the purgatory of Heaven Capital. Qin Weibai did not hide anything. With East Island as the beginning and Eastern Europe as the end, the whole orderly but extremely complicated plan had been told to deity from that time. Mormons would be the end of everything, and it would also be the place of the final battle. Deity naturally had to plant the seeds in Mormons as soon as possible. And the first batch of people to be sent to Eastern Europe, of course, had to be the kind of people he absolutely trusted and would not have the slightest doubt. There were 80 such people. Tian Yin was the leader of this group of people. That was why Tian Yin missed the final battle of East Island. Half a year ago, Tian Yin should have resigned from his post here and returned to East Island to enjoy his life. He did go back, but he came back here in less than 3 months. Now Tian was still in control here. Deity had the same trust in him. Let's go here. Deity took out a map and pointed out a place to Tian. The terrain of Mormons was complicated, and so was the map. Tian glanced at it, then the off-road vehicle turned and began to speed up. It's the place where the urban area and the suburbs meet. There seems to be a manor. What else? Tian asked. That's the manor. Deity said with a smile. I made an appointment with Qin Wei Bai. This is the place she set. Tian said calmly, I'll investigate it carefully. Thank you. Deity looked at Tian for a while, then suddenly reached out and patted him on the shoulder. Tian did not stay silent, nor did he say any polite words. He just said calmly, since it's been hard, when will your highness reward me? Tian. Daybreak's voice was cold. He really felt a little angry. Deity interrupted his anger and asked with a smile, what do you want? There's no need to be polite between us. As expected, Tian did not stand on ceremony. He said lightly, Senluo life-prolonging, and Athanasi halls. Give me one. He glanced at Daybreak and Dawn. Daybreak and Dawn did not hesitate at all. They said in unison, I'll give you mine. Don't, I want Athanasi hall. Tian directly interrupted the two of them. Daybreak and Dawn looked at each other and saw the bitterness and helplessness in each other's eyes. Senluo, Athanasi, and life-prolonging. The power of the 3 hall masters in the purgatory of Heaven Capital was second only to Deity. If Tian wanted to take it, Daybreak and Dawn could give it to him, no matter if it was Senluo Hall or the life-prolonging hall. At this stage of friendship, a little power was really nothing. But Tian did not want it. He just wanted Athanasi Hall. The master of Athanasi Hall was Phoenix. Daybreak looked at Deity, coughed, and said, Tian, I promise you that the comprehensive combat capability of Senluo Hall is definitely stronger than that of Athanasi Hall. How about I follow His Highness and you go to Senluo Hall? Among the 3 giants of the purgatory of Heaven Capital, Daybreak was the strongest. Senluo Hall was naturally stronger than the other 2 halls. If Tian took over this position, he could be said to be the real number 2 figure in the purgatory of Heaven Capital. Tian glanced at him. His eyes suddenly became a little mocking and mean. I take over Senluo Hall? Do I have to do something if I take it? There are some things that you don't have to do. I'm embarrassed. I want to be shameless. Besides, I don't want those brothers who died early to poke at my back. Daybreak's face changed slightly. He smiled bitterly and said nothing. Well, why don't you take over my... Shut up. Tian glanced at Dawn and said directly. Dawn shrugged his shoulders and stopped talking as expected. Tian just looked at Deity and said calmly, Your Highness, will you give it to me or not? Daybreak sighed softly and finally kept silent. Tian's seniority was extremely high. Even in the Undying Palace, the Phoenix was still very polite and respectful to him, treating him as a big brother. Previously, he did not know how the Phoenix offended Tian, but now he understood. The one who offended Tian was not the Phoenix, but His Highness. If I don't give it to you, what will you do? Deity suddenly asked. His eyes were still soft as he looked at Tian. What will you do? Tian was silent for a while and laughed at himself. What can I do? If your highness is reluctant, just let me leave the purgatory of Heaven Capital and go home. Go home? Deity whispered. Huh? No, go to Tianin. Tian whispered, and his eyes softened. I miss the young master. Deity was his master. But he had the young master. There was only one. There was only one. This was the biggest difference. Deity was silent. After a long time, he said slowly, Why? There were many meanings in this question, but there was no emotion, not at all. Deity was calm, without sadness or joy. Tian was silent for a long time before he slowly asked, Because you can't imagine what a child who has lived in despair and fear since he was a child is like. He desperately wants to hold on to everything, desperately wants to protect everything, but he has been powerless. He can't cry, he can't retreat, and he can't be weak. When he is tired, sleepy, tired, or in pain, he can only grit his teeth and keep silent. You don't understand these, so you won't think about the meaning of his existence. If he didn't understand, of course, there was no meaning. Deity was in a daze and suddenly said, "He cried in front of me." Yes, in front of you and only in front of you. Otherwise, who else can he be in front of? Only when he is in front of you, he feels that he is a child. Tianyin laughed mockingly and was extremely cold. But I don't think he will think so now. Deity's heart ached for no reason, and he was silent. The car moved slowly on the flat road in the wind and rain. The street lights on both sides were gradually receding. After going around and around for nearly an hour, when the off-road vehicle was about to leave the city, Deity finally saw the manor built between the darkness and the light. The off-road vehicle stopped at the gate of the manor. 2 security guards in front of the door walked over quietly, looked at Deity, and asked politely, "Who are you looking for?" Deity opened the door and got out of the car. He stood in front of the door and looked at the manor in the dark. The manor was hazy, as if it was shrouded in a faint white mist. The temperature was 0 degrees, and it was raining all over the sky, but the inside of the manor was like heaven. There were clusters of flowers, green grass, and dense trees. In the huge manor, every corner was full of vitality. It was full of vitality. Deity looked at everything in the manor with a complicated look in his eyes. After a long time, he slowly said, "Tell Qin Weibai that I am here." The wind and rain between heaven and earth suddenly quieted down. In an instant, the deep darkness seemed to completely solidify in an instant. Tianyin opened the door. Daybreak was ready to get out of the car. Dawn was going to speak. Deity was going to take a step. But everyone's movements froze in place in an instant. Deity's body tensed up, and he looked into the depths of the manor. A little darkness stretched out in his hand. In an instant, the ink in his hand had turned into a huge and ferocious black sickle. Before entering the door, Deity had already entered the fighting state. A wave of incomparably violent emotions suddenly filled the world. Anger, coldness, disgust, rejection, cruelty, excitement, countless emotions finally turned into the coldest killing intent, which directly spread throughout the entire manor. A little light appeared in front of Deity. It was colorful. The white clothes in his sight were flickering slightly. Every time she took a step, there was a colorful flowing light under her feet, which was dreamy and illusory. Qin Weibai's figure was erratic, and she finally appeared beside Deity. The killing intent between heaven and earth had completely condensed in one place, as if thunder would break out at any time. Qin Weibai's body was filled with colorful light, and she looked ethereal. Deity did not look at her, but stared at the nothingness behind her. After a long time, he slowly said, "Is this the sword phoenix mentioned?" Qin Weibai nodded and said apologetically, "It has a bad temper, and I can't control it." Deity smiled with a complicated meaning. Qin Weibai said calmly, "Your Highness, since you are here, why don't you go in and sit down and talk slowly?" Chapter 547. Reki City finally ushered in the long-lost peace. With the withdrawal of the Purgatory of Heaven capital and the Vatican, the entire Wulan state became completely calm. Prime Minister Riker became extremely busy. He dealt with the media, gave a speech to the people of Wulan state, strengthened their confidence, and looked forward to real peace. At the same time, he had to let his trusted subordinates infiltrate the various systems of Wulan state bit by bit. In addition, he had to negotiate with the Rekvia family, prepare for next year's election, and receive Li Huaqing, the president of Zhongzhou state, who would soon visit Wulan state. He also had to rebuild the presidential palace. Wulan state was very busy. Everyone was busy. President Li Huaqing's private plane would arrive at Reki City International Airport at 7 o'clock tomorrow morning. It seemed like a visit but also like a tour. The calm and busy atmosphere impacted all levels of Wulan state with an unprecedented force, like big waves, strong winds, and heavy rains. The general trend was mighty, and the former rules began to disappear one by one. In Wulan state, wherever the will of Zhongzhou state went, there would be new rules. From tomorrow on, Wulan State would officially enter a new era. The entire country, whether it was anticipation or unwillingness, joy or anger, everyone was preparing for the new era. Every minute and second of Prime Minister Riker's time was extremely precious. Under such circumstances, he could sit outside Li Tianlan's study and wait quietly for 3 hours without showing the slightest anxiety, which showed the strength of the Prime Minister's heart. Li Tianlan was not in a hurry. Jiang Shangyu's disappearance did not seem to bring him much pressure. As soon as he learned the news, he only sent a small number of people to find Jiang Shangyu's whereabouts. After sending people out, Li Tianlan had not asked what the result was until now. There was no vice-marshal in the Snowdance Corps. All the tasks were on the 2 deputy marshals, Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. There were Riker and Rekvia in Wulan State. After the war, Li Tianlan had plenty of time. All he could do was wait. They were waiting for Li Huaqing to visit Wulan State. Other than that, he spent most of his time meditating and honing his sword intent. Ever since he was young, he firmly believed that power, wealth, and everything else could be fake, but only his own strength could be real. It was also the most basic thing. The storm in Reki City gradually subsided. The rainy season was over, and winter was coming. When Li Tianlan woke up from meditation, the cold sword intent in the room had almost frozen everything in the study. A few steady heartbeats were audible to his senses. For clarity, Li Tianlan looked around. There was a soft couch in the study. Beside him was Dongqing Rushi, and a little farther away were Lin Yuxian and Li Wangxing. Together with Li Beitian and Ning Qianqing, they would be his core team in the future. Li Tianlan was never stingy with them. The whole world knew that his swordsmanship was perfect. When he practiced martial arts, he deliberately called Lin Yuxian and Li Wangxing over and imparted his understanding of swordsmanship to them without reservation. As for how much they could comprehend, it depended on their respective talents. Now, it seemed that everyone had gained something. Dongqing Rushi had broken through to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm for a while, and now her realm had been completely stabilized. Li Wangxing also showed signs of breaking through to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm. Lin Yuxian's progress was undoubtedly the slowest, but it was not because his talent was the worst. It was because all aspects of his conditions were close to perfection. After he broke through to the peak of the thunder-shocking realm, even Li Tianlan's kendo did not help him much. This might be the most gratifying thing for the Lin clan. Obviously, Lin Yuxian was about to find his own way. Li Tianlan's eyes swept across everyone's faces. After a moment of silence, he stood up and walked out of the study. "Your Highness." Riker, who had gradually forgotten how long he had waited, stood up immediately and bowed slightly. Li Tianlan nodded, waved his hand, and motioned for him to sit down. "Why are you here?" "Here's the thing." Riker deliberated over his words and said cautiously, "The heads of state of Ross, Oga, Neoya Federation, and Drac have now arrived in Reki City. They hope to meet Your Highness today. I wonder if it's convenient for you, Your Highness?" Wulan State, Ross, Oga, Neoya Federation, and Drac were the 5 Eastern European countries coveted by the whole world. The 5 countries advanced and retreated together, representing a large number of core interests in Eastern Europe. Li Tianlan conquered Wulan State. He should have met the heads of state of the other 4 countries a long time ago, but he never had the time. But today, Li Tianlan's eyes were a little cold. After a moment of silence, he finally shook his head and said, "No need. President Li Huaqing will come tomorrow. We can meet them together." "But, Your Highness, this meeting is very—" Riker wanted to say something but stopped on second thought. "I know." Li Tianlan interrupted him but didn't say much. Even if Riker was one of his own, there was no need to let him know too much about some things. Jiang Shangyu's disappearance had a great impact on him. Li Tianlan had received a phone call from Dongqing Wudi. In addition to a large delegation, there was also a supervisory group following Li Huaqing to Wulan State tomorrow. And it was the supervisory group directly affiliated with Kunlun City. There were only 5 people in the supervisory group, but all of them were thunder-shocking realm experts, which was rare. They came to Eastern Europe specifically to investigate the disappearance of Jiang Shangyu, and they pointed the spearhead at Li Tianlan. This was the collective decision of the Zhongzhou State Parliament. Even Dongqing Wudi did his best to stop it. It could be seen how much the members of Zhongzhou State were afraid of him now. What was ridiculous was that everyone thought that Li Tianlan was in Eastern Europe because he wanted to run Eastern Europe with his own army. In fact, Li Tianlan really wanted to leave here and develop in Tiannan. But in any case, at this time, Li Tianlan could only stay still and not move. Li Huaqing would arrive in Reki City tomorrow. The day before, Li Tianlan had received the heads of state of the 5 countries. When the news reached Eastern Europe, it could only make Zhongzhou State more afraid and suspicious of him. "I can't," Li Tianlan said slowly. His tone was calm and he spoke very slowly, but there was still a sense of depression accumulating in his heart. What kind of person was Rieker? As a real old fox in politics, he almost smelled something wrong at the first time. "Zhongzhou State?" he asked cautiously. Li Tianlan glanced at him and did not speak. Rieker suddenly understood what was going on. He smiled bitterly and whispered, "In this case, I'm afraid that President Li Huaqing can't control the situation." Li Tianlan could not meet the heads of state of the 4 countries today. Although it was only one day, in fact, it was a world apart. Although a considerable part of the delegation led by Li Huaqing was the power of the giant group, he had to leave some soup for other groups. These people were a mix of good and bad. Who knew what would happen after tomorrow? Not to mention these people, even President Li Huaqing might have other plans in his heart. After all, allies and their own people were 2 completely different concepts. After all, this is Eastern Europe, right? Li Tianlan glanced at Rieker, intentionally or unintentionally, and said calmly and indifferently, "Yes." Rieker was shocked and thought about the meaning of Li Tianlan's words. But he said without hesitation, "Please rest assured, Your Highness." Li Tianlan nodded and suddenly asked, "How is the Sword Emperor these days?" Chapter 548. This question was too easy to answer. Not only Rieker, but probably everyone in the Snowdance Corps now knew the Sword Emperor's whereabouts. The Sword Emperor didn't do anything. She simply couldn't be more obedient. He didn't do anything. Rick pondered seriously for a moment before he said, "Presently, the Sword Emperor is very idle every single day. He drinks tea and drinks wine. Besides that, he spends most of his time practicing calligraphy." Practicing calligraphy? Li Tianlan was in a trance for a moment. Rieker nodded, as if he suddenly thought of something, and then said, By the way, His Majesty asked the Snowdance Corps to prepare 2 sets of Han clothes for him yesterday. It was a very strange request." Li Tianlan did not speak. The kimono of East Island was similar to the Han costume, with wide robes and wide sleeves, but the latter was more complicated, gorgeous, and exquisite than the kimono. On the eve of Li Huaqing's visit to Wulan State, Wang Tianzong wanted to wear this ancient costume. In a sense, it was tantamount to showing that he still had his heart in Zhongzhou State. This kind of statement was very obscure, but Li Huaqing would definitely be happy to see it. Li Tianlan thought about it casually and didn't take it seriously. He just asked, "What did he write?" "I don't know." Rick shook his head helplessly. Now the whole world knew that Wang Tianzong was imprisoned in the office of the president of Wulan State by Li Tianlan, but only Wulan State did not dare to think so. Inside and outside Wulan State, everyone in the Snowdance Corps was polite and respectful to Wang Tianzong. He did not want to publicize what Wang Tianzong had written. Did anyone really dare to read it? Li Tianlan leaned on the sofa, lit a cigarette, and muttered to himself, "Practice calligraphy, Hanfu." Suddenly he asked, "Are you sure he only got a few sets of ancient clothes?" "I'm sure," Rick said without hesitation. Wang Tianzong's purchase of ancient costumes through the Snowdance Corps was sent to his desk as soon as possible. In the past 20 years, Wulan State and Zhongzhou State had always been at odds. Naturally, there was no market for the so-called ancient costumes of Zhongzhou State. Rieker still asked someone to buy them from Im and carefully checked them several times before handing them to Wang Tianzong. He personally took over all of this and watched them being sent to Wang Tianzong. There could be no other things in between. Li Tianlan took a drag on his cigarette and fell into deep thought. He completely let go of the matter of the ancient costume. He was thinking about why Wang Tianzong wanted to practice calligraphy. His thoughts kept drifting away. He thought of the Li family, the Lin clan, the Wang family of Beihai, and even more than 20 years ago. When he was at the border of Zhongzhou state, Li Honghe made him practice calligraphy every day since he was a child, and even before he left. A worn-out writing brush landed on the yellowish-white rice paper. Every stroke was a sword light. But this was not the path of the Li family. The Li family's 24 moves of sword only wanted the sword energy to be sharp and break the sky. This was also not the path of the Wang family of Beihai. The martial arts of the Wang family of Beihai broke out in an instant and became invincible in the world. But now Wang Tianzong was practicing calligraphy. Every move of the sword emperor of Zhongzhou state was not meaningless. The Lin clan began to become clear in his mind. He thought of Lin Youxian's attack in front of him. The martial arts of the Lin clan and the Li family were of the same origin, but they were different from each other. They had the same map of God of War and the same 24 moves of sword. The Li family focused on the sword, while the Lin clan focused on the intent. It was not until Li Tianlan traveled thousands of miles in the past 3 years that he understood the meaning of Li Honghe's asking him to practice calligraphy. His sword intent became perfect in the 3-year journey, and the starting point of all this was that worn-out writing brush. Practicing calligraphy was practicing swordsmanship. Wang Tianzong was accumulating his sword intent. Li Honghe understood the emphasis of the Lin clan's martial arts, so did Wang Tianzong. The sword intent continued to be all-encompassing. Wang Tianzong had really reached the last step of the breakthrough. Li Tianlan suddenly felt a little cold inside. He looked out of the window and did not speak for a long time. "Your Highness, do you want?" Riker coughed and hesitated. "No need." Li Tianlan shook his head. "From now on, you don't need to pay attention to the Sword Emperor." "How can that be?" Riker stood up subconsciously. "It's useless to pay attention to it. Let's wait." Li Tianlan stood up and walked to the study, saying calmly, "Wait for him to leave." Riker's brain went blank for a moment, and he asked instinctively, "Where are you going, Your Highness?" Li Tianlan did not look back, but said calmly, "I'm also practicing calligraphy." He pushed open the door of the study and walked in. The petite Dongqing Rushi had already woken up. She blinked her clear eyes and said, "Do you want to practice calligraphy?" Li Tianlan looked at her, smiled, and said softly, "Get the pen and paper ready." He should have thought of this method a long time ago. When he was in the Sky Academy, when he wrote the 3 words, East Emperor Palace, he vaguely knew this method. But now he remembered it after being reminded by Wang Tianzong. Using the pen as a sword and condensing the sword intent. It was to hide the sword and also to nurture the sword. This might be the only way for him to make the perfect sword intent go further. Dongqing Rushi quickly prepared the pen and paper and stood beside Li Tianlan to grind the ink. Her body had a very light fragrance, and she looked very focused. The sound of wind and rain came into his ears. Li Tianlan stood in front of the table with the pen, as if he was holding a sword. A sword intent condensed into a line from his wrist and the tip of the pen. Li Tianlan looked at the paper in front of him quietly. His eyes were calm, like the deep starry sky. At the same time, in the only intact room in the office of the president, Wang Tianzong was also practicing calligraphy. He was wearing a dark Han costume. His lapel and sleeves were fluttering, but his hand holding the pen was unusually stable and did not tremble at all. The room was intact, the white paper, the heavy ink, the dark ancient costume, and the tall and straight figure. Everything seemed to become one invisibly. Everything in the world was shaking gently with the pen in Wang Tianzong's hand. Everything finally became a sword. It was extremely solemn and dignified. Only a few hundred words appeared on the paper, one stroke at a time. Wang Tianzong's handwriting was not beautiful, and it could not even be said to be particularly neat. But there was a kind of awe-inspiring and even submissive power between the horizontal and vertical strokes. This kind of power was not sharp, but heavy enough to crush everything in an instant. His eyes were focused and serious. He put the pen down. The last word. At the same time, Li Tianlan's pen crossed the paper. The first word. An extremely violent sword energy flew up in an instant as Li Tianlan put the pen down, expanding to the whole study, layer upon layer, mysterious and unpredictable. In the study, it instantly became cold. Dongqing Rushi, who was standing next to Li Tianlan, moved a little uneasily. Everything in her sight did not change, but vaguely, it seemed that the whole space began to gradually condense. The sword energy became more and more fierce with the stroke of the pen tip. Lin Fengting, who was meditating, opened his eyes directly. He glanced around blankly and finally saw Li Tianlan behind the desk. This scene was too familiar to him. His pupils suddenly shrank. Li Wangsheng also woke up. Everyone's eyes fell on the rice paper in front of Li Tianlan. That was his first word. It was simple. There was only one horizontal stroke, which was one. No one knew that in the office of the president, Wang Tianzong's last word was also simple. There was only one horizontal stroke, which was also one. It ended with one word. It began with one word. One word was like a sword. Chapter 549. There was no polar night in Reki City. But the continuous heavy rain made Reki City gloomy day and night. There was rain everywhere. There was no sunlight, and the night was no longer pure. Because of the heavy rain, the special flight from Zhongzhou State to Reki City was delayed for several hours. When the special plane painted with the star flag landed at the airport, it was close to noon. It was 10:40 in the morning on August 23 in Eastern Europe. President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State officially arrived in Wulan State. Zhongzhou State's footsteps were moving. From today on, the whole of Eastern Europe would officially enter a new era with the footsteps of Xianxia State. The welcome ceremony could not be any more grand. Headed by Prime Minister Riker, all the high-level officials of Wulan State were present. Both sides of the airport were filled with welcoming crowds with flowers in their hands. The aisle was full of salutes. In order to welcome President Li Huaqing, Prime Minister Riker had specially changed his own car the day before. It was a red flag car for high-level officials of Zhongzhou State. The black and quaint body was parked quietly in the airport, which was very eye-catching. Almost all the media in Eastern Europe praised President Li Huaqing's visit. They called this visit the first handshake between Zhongzhou State and Eastern Europe, and said that the arrival of President Li Huaqing was of epoch-making significance to Wulan State and the whole of Eastern Europe. With the help of Zhongzhou State, the whole of Eastern Europe was bound to be more brilliant tomorrow. Zhongzhou State was bound to be the most trustworthy friend of the Eastern European people, and Eastern Europe would become the most loyal partner of Zhongzhou State. All of them sang praises of merit and virtue. After the collapse of the Violet family and the Morton family, the advantages of the Qin clan and the Rekvia family in the media were fully manifested. The two families almost effortlessly controlled the direction of public opinion in Eastern Europe. In the endless praise of the media, President Li Huaqing came to Eastern Europe this time as a savior. The image of the entire Zhongzhou State became extremely high and bright. As the representative of Zhongzhou State in Wulan State at this time, Li Tianlan was standing on the other side of the welcoming team of Wulan State, subtly distancing himself from the delegation of Wulan State. Behind him stood the two vice-marshals of the Snowdance Corps, Cool Breeze and Drifting Cloud. There were only 3 of them, 1 marshal and 2 lieutenant generals. The 3 of them were dressed in military uniforms. They stood there silently and indifferently, like 3 unsheathed swords. Countless cameras near the airport were moving in an orderly manner, recording all the images and sending them to major TV stations around the world as soon as possible. At this moment, Wulan State had become the focus of the world. In the heavy rain, the plane finally stopped. The gangway ladder fell and the cabin opened. The figure of President Li Huaqing of Zhongzhou State appeared in front of the cabin door. The president, who was in his 60s, was full of energy and waved to the crowd below with a smile. His eyes were calm and gentle, and he looked straight ahead as if he had seen far away. At this moment, whether it was the general or the prime minister, the senior officials or the civilians, or even this country, they all belonged to Zhongzhou State. Li Huaqing was in a trance for a moment, and then he took a deep look at Li Tianlan, who was standing on the other side of the crowd. Li Huaqing adjusted his mood, walked down the gangway ladder slowly, and shook hands with Prime Minister Rieker, who was coming toward him. There were not many high-level officials of Wulan State. Rieker followed him and introduced everyone's duties in detail. It was not known whether Li Huaqing was listening or not, but he just nodded with a calm smile. After shaking hands with the last high-level official of Wulan State, Li Huaqing walked up to Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan, who was dressed in military uniform, stood taller. His expression was calm, and he raised his hand to salute. "You're very good. The Snowdance Corps is very good." Li Huaqing stood in front of Li Tianlan, and his voice was soft and clear. "Thank you, Marshal Li." He reached out his hand and tidied Li Tianlan's military uniform and rank. Then, he raised his arm and saluted back solemnly. In an instant, the flashing lights of countless cameras connected into one. The next second, the whole world was in an uproar. Because countless cameras directly captured the epaulets on Li Tianlan's shoulders. The dark world was okay. But ordinary people all over the world could not believe their eyes. For ordinary people, they might not understand what the sharp sword on Li Tianlan's epaulet meant, but few people did not know what the 4 golden stars surrounded by the golden olive branch meant. Marshal of Zhongzhou State. Such a young marshal? The TV screens of various countries froze on Li Tianlan's face and epaulets. The combination of the young and calm face and the golden epaulets brought an almost unforgettable impact and made everyone's heart surge. This might be the first time that the special warfare system of Zhongzhou State appeared in front of the world. At this moment, it was raining in Reki City. But Li Tianlan stood in front of Li Huaqing and the whole world under the rain, and he was unprecedentedly brilliant. Mormons. In the living room of the manor, Li Tianlan's face appeared on the ultra-clear TV screen. A white and slender palm gently touched Li Tianlan's face across the screen, gentle and almost careful. Qin Weibai's fingers moved gently on the screen. She stared deeply at the picture on the TV, and her warm eyes were full of intoxication. "Is he handsome?" she asked suddenly. The picture on the TV began to change. Qin Weibai turned around and looked at a woman behind her. She was dressed in a white dress. The woman behind her was dressed in a white robe. "Handsome," the woman in the white robe said softly. She was tall and slender, and her face was exquisite. She looked dreamlike and perfect without any flaws. "You really have a good eye." She looked at Qin Weibai and exclaimed sincerely, "Do you like it?" Qin Weibai asked softly. The woman hesitated and lowered her head. Light footsteps sounded outside the door. Flaming Fire walked in, looked at Qin Weibai, and said, "Boss, are you looking for me?" Qin Weibai nodded, turned to look at the screen, and said calmly, "Since the president is here, our plan should start. Inform him to get ready for action." Flaming Fire, who had been prepared, nodded. She took 2 steps back and was ready to leave. But the moment she turned around, her eyes inadvertently swept over the woman in the white robe behind Qin Weibai. The woman just raised her head, and their eyes met. The woman in the white robe looked a little surprised. But Flaming Fire's body suddenly stiffened. She stared at the woman in her sight, as if she had seen a ghost. "Go and do your work." Qin Weibai's cold voice sounded. Flaming Fire suddenly came to her senses, turned around subconsciously, and left. Before she went out, she staggered and almost fell down. Qin Weibai turned to look at the woman in the white robe behind her. She was dreamlike, perfect and flawless, like a phantom. She was silent for a long time before she repeated her question, "Do you like it?" The woman in the white robe hesitated. Qin Weibai said directly, "I'll give him to you, okay?" Chapter 550. There was a dead silence in the room. Only the voice on the TV screen was endlessly praising the friendliness, tolerance, and fraternity of Zhongzhou State. More than 80% of the people in Wulan State were eagerly looking forward to the cooperation between Wulan State and Zhongzhou State. Everything was so beautiful. But the reality was so cruel. News and reality were like 2 different worlds. The screen was constantly switching. President Li Huaqing, Prime Minister Riker, many high-level officials of Wulan State, a large delegation, the young, sharp and calm marshal of Xianxia State, who was as deep as the starry sky. In the constantly switching pictures, a group of people walked to the black car with a red flag at the airport. Prime Minister Riker took 2 quick steps, bent down, and opened the door for Li Huaqing himself. This scene fell into the eyes of people all over the world. The salute and cheers seemed to pause for a moment. The news also paused for a moment. Li Huaqing smiled and sat in the back of the car. But Prime Minister Riker did not get up. He still kept his bent posture and waited with a smile on his face. The young marshal who had shocked the world looked at Riker with a smile and also got into the car. Riker straightened up and carefully closed the door. The news anchor was obviously stuttering. He stuttered a few lines before he regained his composure. The woman in white and Qin Weibai watched this scene quietly. Qin Weibai's eyes were warm and gentle. That kind of deep love was extremely strong, with a kind of unforgettable power. The woman in white was in a trance. Her eyes were bright. When she was in a trance, her cold eyes were like a shaking starry sky. "I'll give him to you, okay?" Qin Weibai said softly. Her voice was very light, but it carried the weight of the world. "Give him to me." The woman in white's voice was clear and soft, with a kind of confusion and complexity, as if it were yesterday. She was indeed beautiful. Perfect. The so-called perfection could be described with any beautiful word, but no beautiful word was enough to describe it. Her face was exquisite and sharp. Every line and every detail of her body was flawless. Dressed in simple yet elegant white clothes, she stood there as if her entire body was glowing. Noble and holy, cold and pure, she was devastatingly beautiful, like a grand and magnificent dream. Her voice was light, clear and soft. "He has always been mine." Qin Weibai was silent for a while. Then he nodded. "That's right, he's yours." She looked into her eyes. "So, do you love him?" A hint of confusion appeared in the woman's sparkling eyes. "I don't know." She moved her feet lightly and sat on the sofa at the side. A book was placed next to the sofa. It was neither thin nor thick, and its cover was a vast expanse of white. Her slender fingers took the book and opened it. The handwriting inside was not printed, but handwritten. The handwriting was delicate, and every stroke was carefully written. She lowered her head to look at the book in her hands, lost in thought. "Everyone has a story, so everyone is a story," Qin Weibai said softly. "Putting everyone's story into one story is the whole world." "But this is not my world." The woman raised her head and looked straight into Qin Weibai's eyes. "But Tianlan is here," Qin Weibai said softly. The woman stopped talking and lowered her head again, as if she was trying to think. "Don't think about it." Qin Weibai chuckled. "Perfect. You love him." Her tone was brief, but extremely sure. The woman raised her head and seemed to be a little dissatisfied. "But because I love him," Qin Weibai said calmly, "you will naturally protect what I love. I'm not your shadow and I'm not your puppet." There was a touch of anger in the woman's cold eyes. Qin Weibai looked at her quietly for a long time. The woman met her eyes without dodging. "I'm sorry." Qin Weibai didn't know how much time had passed. It felt like a minute, but it also felt like a lifetime. Qin Weibai spoke softly with an apologetic tone. There was a flash of fear in the eyes of the woman in white. She shook her head subconsciously and stammered, "No, no. You are indeed not my shadow, nor are you my puppet." Qin Weibai said softly, "At least, not now. But I am your destiny, and also your guilt. This has long been decided." The woman's breathing gradually quickened. She suppressed her inner emotions, but all her emotions seemed to have reached the critical point. She began to collapse, and her voice also sounded like she was about to cry. "Why, who knows?" Qin Weibai walked up to her, reached out and gently stroked her soft black hair. She whispered, "In fact, it's not bad. At least, you have the qualification to be by his side." A colorful light lit up the room. The sword intent in the nothingness was extremely soft. The soft sword intent wrapped around the woman in white and then Qin Weibai. It seemed to be comforting, but it didn't know who to comfort. The sword body turned slightly, and the slight sound of the sword seemed to be a sigh. The two of them were completely enveloped in the colorful light. One stood and one sat. Both were perfect and flawless. Unparalleled charm? Unparalleled? There was a sudden knock on the door. The woman in white was shocked and subconsciously wanted to stand up to avoid it. "Sit down." Qin Weibai whispered, "Mr. Lin is not an outsider." The woman in white hesitated and slowly sat down. Qin Weibai sat beside her, looked at the door and said, "Please come in." Lin Fengting walked in from the outside with a chuckle. He saw Qin Weibai and the woman in white sitting on the sofa at the first moment. Even Lin Fengting, who had a strong will and had seen too many bizarre things in his life, was stunned for a moment and dazzled. He shook his head subconsciously and carefully looked at the space where the two of them were. He was dumbfounded, and his eyes became extremely strange for a moment. "Qin, this? Well this?" Lin Fengting's eyes kept glancing around, and he couldn't say a word for a while. He stuttered several times before he managed to calm down. He took a deep breath and said, "This is... Let me introduce you." Qin Weibai stood up and whispered, "This is Mr. Lin Fengting, the current patriarch of the Lin clan, and my most respected elder." She paused and said, "The only one." The woman in white stood up subconsciously and bowed slightly to Lin Fengting. In a short time, Lin Fengting's forehead was covered with cold sweat. He waved his hand randomly and stared at the woman in white without caring about politeness. Qin Weibai looked at the woman in front of her with a smile and whispered, "This is... I have my own name." The woman in white suddenly said, "At least now, I have the right to use my own name." The corner of Lin Fengting's mouth twitched, and he looked confused. Qin Weibai nodded and said quietly, "Her name is Xianxia." The family name was not unimportant. But standing in the woman's current position, she had no family name. Xianxia, Xianxia. This name was really worthy of the name. Lin Fengting was silent for a long time, then slowly exhaled and whispered, "No wonder, no wonder." He looked at Qin Weibai with complicated eyes and said, "It's her?" Qin Weibai nodded. Lin Fengting didn't know what to say for a moment. He suddenly wanted to drink, but there was no wine here. He had to light a cigarette, take a deep breath, and then said with emotion, "You are simply a miracle." Qin Weibai smiled. The woman in white reached out and took out a piece of gauze. She covered her face with the gauze and left the room with light steps. "She is your real trump card, isn't she?" Lin Fengting looked at Qin Weibai, and no one knew what kind of emotion was contained in his tone. "Yes." Qin Weibai nodded calmly. Lin Fengting was silent for a while. He seemed to suddenly think of something and said, I just remembered that flaming fire is waiting outside. It seems that she wants to make trouble, and she is full of murderous intent." As he said this, he subconsciously wanted to turn around. Qin Weibai had turned on the monitor outside the door and said calmly, "It's okay." A sword light lit up on the monitor outside the door. The sword light was cold and sharp. Flaming fire held the long sword in her hand, and the blade fell steadily on the neck of the woman in white. The supermaster who had the closest relationship with Qin Weibai in Samsara Palace was expressionless, but her eyes were full of murderous intent. "Who the hell are you?" After the woman in white left Qin Weibai, her whole aura seemed to change quietly and became extremely quiet. She looked at flaming fire calmly and said with a chuckle, "Who do you think I am? You've seen me before." "I did see you before, but I didn't really see you until today." There was a suppressed rage and panic in Flaming Fire's voice. "Who the hell are you? What do you think?" The woman in white smiled playfully. "Do you really think that I dare not kill you?" Flaming Fire's voice was cold. "Do you really dare to?" The woman in white asked back. Flaming Fire's eyes became sharp, and the long sword suddenly pressed down. The blade cut the skin of the woman in white in an instant, but there was no blood. The white clothes in front of her twisted in a trance and finally became illusory. Flaming Fire raised her head and looked at the door. 10 meters away from her, The woman in white was standing there. What Flaming Fire had just seen was an illusion. Flaming Fire took a deep breath, and her plump chest rose and fell slightly. The woman in white glanced at her and said blandly, "Your sword is good, but your vision is poor." She turned to leave and said slowly, "Let me introduce myself. I am Xianxia." Lin Fengting, who saw this scene through the monitor screen, did not speak for a long time. Qin Weibai took the initiative to say, "What can I do for you, sir?" Lin Fengting's heart was in a mess. He managed to sort out his thoughts and said slowly, "Flaming Fire just said that it's about to start?" Qin Weibai poured a cup of tea for Lin Fengting. "It's time. But in the current situation, where do we start?" Lin Fengting asked. "The situation in Eastern Europe should naturally start from Eastern Europe," Qin Weibai said calmly. Lin Fengting was silent for a while, and then tentatively said, "The chaos in Eastern Europe began with the collapse of the Polar Ground Alliance. The base alliance is not far from here. Their headquarters can be said to be here." Qin Weibai whispered, "Since the chaos started here, it will end here. Let's start with the Polar Ground Alliance." Lin Fengting took a deep look at her and did not speak. "If I say that Sir is my most respected elder, will you believe me?" Qin Weibai suddenly asked. "Of course not." Lin Fengting laughed. "Boss Qin, what kind of person do you think so highly of me? There must be a reason. Because of your friendship, because of the saint of the Lin clan." Qin Weibai finished a cup of tea, stood up and said slowly, "I don't know the result of this battle. I want to ask you something." Lin Fengting nodded. "Go ahead. If I die, everything in the Lin clan for 20 years can be handed over to Xianxia. I only ask for a cemetery. Then my ashes can be buried on the hill behind the flowing light waterfall of the Lin clan." Qin Weibai whispered. Lin Fengting's face changed, and his eyes were a little bitter. "If I am lucky enough to survive," Qin Weibai laughed. "At that time, please take me away, sir." "Leave." It was normal to leave. Qin Weibai's voice was also very ordinary, but Lin Fengting heard a touch of determination. Lin Fengting stood there without saying a word. "I'll take it as a yes," Qin Weibai whispered. She left the room with the sword in the void. "Where are you going?" Lin Fengting asked. "Reki City." Qin Weibai's voice was calm and distant. Lin Fengting walked to the window and looked at the night rain outside. Under the polar night, whether it was noon or late at night, it was night and heavy rain outside the window. The darkness gradually became deeper. Lin Fengting could already see the end of everything. That was the end of the old era. It was coming to an end. There must be an end. Chapter 551. The rain beat on the car window, and the sound was messy and hurried. The atmosphere in the car was depressing and dull. Li Huacheng looked at the scenery outside the window with a smile. Through the rain, the scenery was blurred, and his eyes were a little blurred. "Your Highness, Mr. President, shall we go straight back to the hotel?" Riker sat in the passenger seat and turned around to ask. Under normal circumstances, when the president of Zhongzhou State visited Wulan State, he naturally had to stay in the office of the president temporarily. But now the office of the president had become a ruin, and only Wang Tianzong's room was still intact. Wulan State could only temporarily arrange the distinguished guests of Zhongzhou State in the hotel. Li Huacheng sensitively noticed the order of Riker's address. He smiled and said softly, "I'm a guest. I'm here for a lot of things, but not much. Mr. Prime Minister, we must have a good chat when we have time." "Of course." Riker nodded quickly, and thoughts kept turning in his mind. Li Huacheng only had 5 days to stay in Wulan State, and the other 2 days had to travel to the other 4 countries. Time was very tight. This was his first day. Li Huacheng had a reason to do a lot of things, such as arranging a meeting with the high level of Wulan State and signing the agreement as soon as possible. He also wanted to see Wang Tianzong, who was imprisoned in the office of the president, or visit the Snowdance Corps. In addition, Wulan State also prepared a very high-level banquet. The theme of the banquet was the future development of Eastern Europe. As Xianxia State's position in Wulan State gradually stabilized, the general trend of the whole Eastern Europe gradually stabilized. Everyone knew that if they wanted to survive in Eastern Europe and live well in the future, they had to depend on Xianxia State. Therefore, at this banquet, Wulan State sent invitations to countless families and groups throughout Eastern Europe. At the same time, the delegation brought by Li Huaqing also participated in the banquet. This was the first large-scale banquet held by the forces of Xianxia State and Eastern Europe. To some extent, it could almost determine the pattern of Eastern Europe for at least decades. This could be said to be the most important thing. But the funny thing was that the time of the banquet had not been accurately set yet. Riker had to wait for Li Huaqing's nod. He thought for a moment and said tentatively, "Mr. President, here's the thing. Wulan State has prepared a very grand welcome banquet. Tonight, I don't know, put it off for the time being." Li Tianlan suddenly said, "Tomorrow night." Rick was stunned. He subconsciously wanted to nod, but he felt that something was wrong. He could only continue to look at Li Huaqing, but his eyes were obviously a little perfunctory. Li Huaqing's smile remained unchanged. He looked at Li Tianlan and said softly, "Tianlan, do you have a different opinion?" Li Tianlan looked at the wind and rain outside the window. Under the wind and rain, Reki City was desolate. On that day, his sword lit up in front of the Caesar Hotel and tore up half of the city. The sword was 10,000 meters long, and the damage left in the city had not been repaired yet. At this time, Wulan State was much more lively, but there were still some traces of the war. The Snowdance Corps has 20,000 people. Li Tianlan said calmly, "From I'm to here, more than 2,000 soldiers have fallen. We marched all the way, covering a distance of hundreds of miles, and stained with blood all the way. On the night we beat back the dark forces, more than 1,200 soldiers of the Snowdance Corps fell in this city. We can achieve what we have now because the Snowdance Corps has paid nearly 4,000 lives." Rick's face was a little pale, and he was fidgeting. Li Tianlan's voice became calmer and calmer. Whether it was an invincible realm expert or the coalition forces of other countries, the Snowdance Corps has never retreated. We fought all the way from I'm to Reki City. There was no deserter in the Snowdance Corps. They all died in a dignified battle, so they are all martyrs. This city and this country will be engraved with the brand of Xianxia State in the future. But no one should forget everything here. It has been dyed red by the blood of the martyrs of Xianxia State. He turned to look at Li Huaqing and said calmly, "Mr. President, you shouldn't forget." Li Huaqing was not embarrassed. Instead, he looked solemn. He looked at Li Tianlan, nodded solemnly, and said, "I think I know what I should do today." He glanced at Rick and said gently, "Mr. Prime Minister, let's go to the station of the Snowdance Corps now and inform the rear vehicles. All the members of the delegation have to go." Rick smiled bitterly and nodded. In fact, when the president of Xianxia State visited Wulan State, everything was arranged in advance. However, there was a small disagreement between Rick and Li Tianlan. Li Tianlan's meaning was very simple. On the first day of Li Huaqing's arrival in Wulan State, he had to visit the Snowdance Corps. The ashes of nearly 4,000 martyrs had not yet been buried, and the star flag of Xianxia State had already flown up in the Hero Square in the center of Reki City. For Li Tianlan, it was his most important thing to bury thousands of martyrs. However, Rick also had his own pressure. Now, the entire top management of Wulan State, and even the interest class of the whole Eastern Europe, hoped that the dinner could be held as soon as possible. The pressure Rick was under could be imagined. After weighing the pros and cons, he put the dinner first and the memorial service later. In this way, Li Tianlan might not like it, but Rick believed that he could explain it. However, Rick glanced at Li Tianlan and sighed softly in his heart. He picked up the walkie-talkie and began to instruct the motorcade to turn around. The Snowdance Corps was still temporarily stationed in the parade square in front of the office of the president. When the luxurious motorcade drove into the square, all the top management of the Snowdance Corps had arrived. The soldiers, injured or not, were all gathered in the square. When Li Huaqing got out of the car, there were only a little more than 10,000 elites stationed in Reki City now. They raised their hands and saluted at the same time. The wind and rain were messy, but a whistling sound broke out in the square because of the tens of thousands of people raising their hands. In an instant, it seemed that even the wind and rain between heaven and earth had become fierce. Li Tianlan followed Li Huaqing. The top management of the Snowdance Corps came over. Cool breeze and drifting clouds stood on the left and right. Standing in the middle of them was Tribulation, who had just come out of the hospital. Tribulation's body was still weak and his face was pale, but his body was as sharp as a sword. Li Huaqing shook hands with him and said gently, "How's your injury?" "I'm fine." Tribulation's voice was clear and indifferent. Such an occasion was obviously not suitable for detailed discussion. He pointed to the temporary high platform in the center of the square and said softly, "President, please." Li Huaqing took a deep breath, looked at the soldiers of Xianxia state who raised their hands and saluted him, and strode to the high platform. There were no flowers on the high platform, only a microphone. Li Huaqing stood on it and was instantly drenched by the wind and rain. Li Huaqing held the microphone, his eyes calm and dignified. The next second, his voice resounded throughout the square and the whole world. "You are all heroes of Xianxia state, the pride of Xianxia state. I am Li Huaqing. Today, at this moment, I promise you in the name of the President of Xianxia state that Xianxia state will never let down any martyr or soldier. In this war, whether survivors or victims, Xianxia state is proud of you. Today, I am here with you, to send all the martyrs on their way." In the wind and rain, Li Huaqing's voice was clear and loud. This speech of less than 10 minutes had no passion, no blood, only calm and solemnity. In the square, countless members of the Snowdance Corps began to turn and walk to the Hero Square in the center of the city. Li Huaqing walked down the high platform, looked at the empty office of the president, and looked at the only intact room in sight. He was silent for a while. "Let's go and see Tianzong." He looked at Li Tianlan and said calmly. It was not a question. Li Tianlan nodded and led the way. At the funeral of the Snowdance Corps, there had to be a president and a sword emperor. There had to be a sword emperor. Wang Tianzong was still practicing calligraphy. Everything outside seemed to have no effect on him. He stood in front of the table with a pen, so focused. When Li Tianlan and Li Huaqing came in, he did not look up and just said casually, "You're here?" "I just arrived." Li Huaqing looked around with a chuckle and said, "It seems that you're doing well here. It's good to be able to cultivate one's body and mind." Wang Tianzong spoke calmly and wrote calmly. A lot of rice paper had been scattered in the room. It was densely packed, and the strokes were light and restrained. At the end of each stroke, there was a character. Li Tianlan quietly looked at the countless rice papers full of handwriting. There was clearly no sword intent around him, but the power in each stroke made him feel as if he couldn't breathe. His gaze fell on the last piece of calligraphy. Wang Tianzong's last stroke was very short. "How's my handwriting?" he asked softly. "Good handwriting." Li Tianlan did not hesitate. He nodded directly and said affirmatively. "Good handwriting?" Wang Tianzong smiled and suddenly waved the pen in his hand. One word was like a sword. In an instant, Wang Tianzong seemed to wave a sword in front of Li Tianlan. Everything in front of him disappeared in front of Li Tianlan. The house, the president, and the sword emperor completely disappeared. There was only one sword left in his sight. There was no sword energy or killing intent. It was light and dignified, pure sword. Li Tianlan suddenly closed his eyes. His eyes seemed to be stimulated by something, and tears kept flowing. Wang Tianzong's voice sounded in his ear. "Your sword is very important to my achievements today." Li Tianlan laughed self-deprecatingly. That night, he and Wang Tianzong fought across half of the city, but the fundamental purpose was to mislead Wang Tianzong. But Wang Tianzong was not misled. Instead, he completed the sword and completely completed his sword intent. Li Tianlan opened his eyes and looked at Wang Tianzong. Wang Tianzong's eyes were gentle and deep, like the sky and the sea, unfathomable. "You flatter me," Li Tianlan said calmly. "That's the truth." Wang Tianzong turned back, picked up the calligraphy, and said quietly, "In return, this calligraphy is for you." Li Tianlan quietly looked at the calligraphy in Wang Tianzong's hand. There was rice paper everywhere in the room, and Wang Tianzong's notes were everywhere. But the notes were not the same. In other words, they were decreasing. Wang Tianzong's first stroke was full of hundreds of words, and the fewer the words were at the end. At this moment, there were only 2 sentences left in Wang Tianzong's hand. Each stroke was simple but majestic. The signature was Beihai Tianzong. There was no surname. With Beihai, there was no need for a surname. Li Tianlan stared at the handwriting in front of him. 2 simple sentences, but they showed the spirit of the Sword Emperor. The unparalleled sword in the world. I am the most ambitious person in history. Between the strokes, the sword intent formed a storm and completely swallowed Li Tianlan. I am the most ambitious person in history. What a peerless sword. Li Tianlan was silent for a long time before he said in a hoarse voice, "Perfect." Chapter 552. For Wulan State, the Hero Square in Reki City had been endowed with a lot of sacred meanings since the founding of the country. This was the resting place of heroes and the origin of countless epic legends. There were countless monuments in the huge Hero Square, and each monument represented a soul-stirring story. This was the most sacred place in Reki City, and it was also the cemetery chosen by Li Tianlan for the victims of the Snowdance Corps. It was raining heavily and the sky was dark. Tens of thousands of elites of the Snowdance Corps had completely surrounded the Hero Square. There were 3 extremely tall flagpoles in the center of the square. The star flag of Xianxia State was hung on the highest flagpole. Even in the heavy rain, it was still flying. A little lower than the star flag was the flag of Wulan State, and the flagpole on the left side of the star flag was still empty. Cool breeze and drifting cloud, dressed in military uniform, stood under the flagpole, holding a scarlet military flag and standing solemnly. The usually quiet and elegant Hero Square had been completely replaced by a warm scarlet color. The intense scarlet color covered the center of the square, and even the monuments around it had become pale under the illumination of the intense color. That was the military flag of the Snowdance Corps, which was made by Prime Minister Rieker himself. The pattern of the military flag was simple and clear. An extremely sharp golden longsword was outlined on the scarlet base. Golden spots of light were dancing around the long sword, like flying snow, flames, and falling blood. This was the military flag that Wulan State had started making a few days ago. It was nearly thousands of meters long and wide. At this time, the huge scarlet flag was spread on the Hero Square. This scarlet color seemed to be integrated with heaven and earth. All the experts above the fire-flaming realm of the Snowdance Corps gathered around the huge military flag. There were more than 10,000 soldiers of the Snowdance Corps, and there were actually many experts in the fire-flaming realm. However, the military flag, which almost covered the entire square, was so big that even if all the experts in the fire-flaming realm stood there, they still seemed extremely sparse. But in terms of function, hundreds of experts in the fire-flaming realm were enough. In the strong wind and heavy rain, every expert in the fire-flaming realm was controlling his own power. The surging heat waves completely dispelled the chill between heaven and earth and evaporated the rain. In the rainy weather, the whole square was dry. The military flag of the Snowdance Corps was still scarlet and unstained by dust. Under this huge military flag, the ashes of nearly 4,000 people who had sacrificed their lives were quietly placed. The ashes were light, but for Xianxia State, they weighed more than anything else. From the high-level members of the Snowdance Corps to the soldiers, all stood quietly in every corner of the square. There was no wind or rain, no cold or sound here. It was so quiet that it seemed to be frozen. When Li Huaqing and Li Tianlan came to the Hero Square, they saw such a quiet and almost eternal scene. Wang Tianzong, who had walked out of the office of the president, stood not far from the two of them. Looking at this scene, he narrowed his eyes. I should have come here earlier. Li Huaqing watched this scene quietly. He was silent for a long time before he spoke softly. It's not too late. Li Tianlan looked at the military flag below and said calmly, Thank you. Li Huaqing took a deep look at Li Tianlan and said, "Thank you for letting me come here. As the president of Xianxia State, it would be a sin for me to come here 1 minute late, let alone 1 day late. A hero's soul must not be desecrated." He looked at the hero square, which was so calm that it was almost frozen, and said in a deep voice, "I only know that many people here died unjustly." Li Tianlan said blandly, "They are the most elite soldiers of Xianxia State. Xianxia State is the most powerful country in the world, so they are the most elite soldiers in the world. Such soldiers should die on the real battlefield, in the fight with other forces. That's a worthy death." Li Huaqing did not speak. Li Tianlan's tone was low. "But some of them are not. They did die in the war. But in the war, some people forgot their position. Mr. President, does it make sense to die like this?" Li Huaqing still did not speak. He could not express his opinion. The Wang family of Beihai had a strong foundation. However, the Devil Troop had always been the deepest hidden trump card of the Wang family of Beihai. No one could even have definite evidence to prove that the Devil Troop did exist. But there was no doubt that they were powerful. The trial day happened overnight. The Devil Troop seriously injured Raphael, the commander of the Dark Knights, Xianxia, destroyed the holy punishment of Void, and killed Cass Rotter, the god of war of Star State. No matter what the process was, the results and achievements were real. They were extremely brilliant. Everyone was shocked by the incredible combat capability of the Devil Troop. But only a few people recalled that when the Devil Troop created such a result that night, how many troops and allies of Xianxia State died in the hands of the Devil Troop. But there was no evidence. Even now, no one could prove that the Devil Troop belonged to the Wang family of Beihai. On the surface, Wang Tianzong was imprisoned by Li Tianlan in the office of the president that night. The power of the Wang family of Beihai did not appear on any side of the battlefield. Under such circumstances, even if Li Huaqing was dissatisfied, how could he express his opinion? Li Tianlan did not expect Li Huaqing to express his opinion. He just looked ahead and said calmly, "I will investigate it to the end. These are my soldiers. As long as I am alive, I will give them an explanation. My position is in Xianxia State and the Snowdance Corps. I will make anyone who targets the Snowdance Corps pay a heavy price." Li Huaqing subconsciously glanced at Wang Tianzong. Wang Tianzong stood aside, looking as usual. Li Tianlan did not say much and walked to the huge military flag in the square. Behind the three of them, more and more people appeared. Men and women, old and young, there were nearly hundreds of people. These were the members of the delegation brought by Li Huaqing this time, and they would also become the backbone of dividing the interests of the 5 Eastern European countries. Their achievements today were inextricably linked to the sacrifices of the Snowdance Corps. It was reasonable for them to come. On the other side of the crowd, Riker led a group of high-level officials of Wulan State and quietly watched Li Tianlan, who was getting closer and closer. Riker, who now held the power of the president as the prime minister, had a complicated look in his eyes. Looking at the ashes under the military flag, at Li Tianlan, and at the countless monuments on the hero square around him, he suddenly felt sad. Not for Xianxia State, not for the Snowdance Corps, but for himself and Wulan State. Maybe there was no Wulan State anymore. The real Wulan State would become a thing of the past from today on. Just like this hero square, the legends would be forgotten little by little. This place would become the resting place of new heroes, the land of heroes of Xianxia State. Maybe in a few months or years, the stories on every monument here would disappear, and some well-known heroic deeds would be erased from the textbooks of Wulan State. The heroic deeds of the Snowdance Corps would appear in new textbooks and in various media and public opinions. In another 20 or 30 years, these ashes would become real heroes, and the heroes who really belonged to Wulan State would be completely annihilated. It was so cruel. In a real invasion, the losers would be robbed not only of their interests, but also of their culture, traditions, ideas, and even beliefs. Everything would be obliterated, replaced, and completely subverted silently and quietly. Riker walked to Li Tianlan's side and said with some difficulty, "Your Highness, shall we start now?" Li Tianlan nodded. Rieker turned around and made a gesture. In front of the flagpole in the center of the square, Cool Breeze, who was holding the flag of the Snowdance Corps, suddenly raised the flag in his hand. The flag slowly rose in Drifting Cloud's hand. The national anthem of Zhongzhou State resounded throughout the Hero Square, throughout Reki City, and throughout Wulan State. At this moment, in every city and every corner of the 5 countries in Eastern Europe, schools, businesses, governments, everyone was mourning and praying. The lingering national anthem was loud and passionate. The elites of the Snowdance Corps in the square moved. The huge military flag on the ground was lifted little by little. The soldiers of the Snowdance Corps carefully picked up the urns one by one and put them into the pit dug nearby. The content of the monument on the square would be gradually replaced, and the lives of all the victims would be engraved on the monument. Li Tianlan and even Li Huaqing picked up the cinerary casket and gently put it in. The wind and rain continued. The singing became more and more majestic. Tens of thousands of soldiers of the Snowdance Corps raised their guns at the same time. The sound of gunfire roared in the city and surged into the sky. Li Tianlan, dressed in a marshal's uniform, was the first to pick up the shovel and silently buried the earth in the roar of gunfire. The national anthem slowly stopped. The sound of gunfire disappeared. Tens of thousands of elites of the Snowdance Corps began to gather together again. The military song that once belonged to the Border Control Corps sounded in the square. The tune was leisurely, not sad, only a touch of pride and nostalgia. There were new graves everywhere in the Hero Square. Perhaps a long time later, the new graves here would also become flat and become a square again. But as long as Li Tianlan was still alive, as long as the Li family was still there, it would always be the most sacred place in the whole of Wulan State and even the 5 countries in Eastern Europe. In the singing, the old era of Wulan State was completely buried. Li Huaqing, with a solemn face, raised his hand to salute. All the soldiers of the Snowdance Corps raised their hands to salute at the same time. Wang Tianzong also raised his hand. Only Li Tianlan didn't. Under everyone's gaze, Li Tianlan slowly took a step forward. There was a vast expanse of new graves. His eyes were in a trance for a moment, and his knees bent slightly. In the eyes of the world, he knelt down in front of the new graves. In an instant, tens of thousands of soldiers of the Snowdance Corps suddenly fell silent. Li Huaqing's face changed slightly, and he subconsciously said, "Marshal Li, what are you doing?" Wang Tianzong's eyes had narrowed tightly. Li Tianlan shook his head and said calmly, "As I said, some brothers here died unjustly. Today, I swear in front of all the brothers that some people have to pay the price for doing something wrong. I will seek justice for them and let them die a worthy death." He lowered his body and his head hit the rain-soaked floor heavily. Once, twice, 3 times. Heaven and earth were silent. All the soldiers of the Snowdance Corps looked at this scene in a daze. At this moment, there was no Li Huaqing or Wang Tianzong in their eyes. There was only the figure kneeling and kowtowing. That was their marshal. Li Tianlan kowtowed 3 times heavily and slowly got up. Wang Tianzong's face suddenly changed. He raised his head and looked around. Li Tianlan straightened up. As if heaven and earth corresponded, light suddenly appeared in the dark sky. The quiet light enveloped the whole square. It was a riot of colors. The light appeared from all directions and gathered toward Li Tianlan crazily. Li Tianlan raised his head and was in a daze. He subconsciously stretched out his palm. The outstretched palm seemed to be pressed down by something in the nothingness. In an instant, the colorful light surged and shot wildly. Endless colorful light rushed out of the light and went straight up into the sky. The wind and rain all over the sky dissipated. Li Tianlan stood there. His hand grasped a rainbow, vast and boundless, incomparably dazzling. It was like a miracle. You're tuning in to the Wandering Hero YouTube channel. Don't forget to subscribe and join us on this journey to catch the most captivating stories.